Stop it. Get some help.
Welcome everybody, Mr. Lee here, and this is the first part of the culture unit where we'll be talking about cultural landscapes, methods of diffusion, and the various acting forces of culture. And not to worry, we will definitely get into how those TikToks in the intro relate to the cultural unit. The first term we will go over is a cultural trait, and a cultural trait is a singular practice of a country, and these cultural traits can range from the hijab to architectural styles or languages and calligraphy. Because there are so many different cultural traits and practices around the world, people's attitudes towards these practices can vary drastically. One can look at a particular practice with a sense of acceptance, and others can look at that same practice with a sense of resistance. Take food, for example. If an individual has never had sushi before and they are introduced to it, they can react to it in one of two ways. First, they can come from a place of understanding despite their own practices, and that would be known as cultural relativism. On the other hand, if the person is judging because that particular practice is so beyond what their culture would do, as eating raw fish is not a standard European practice, that would be known as ethnocentrism, which is the act of evaluating other customs based on their own. And now let's actually talk about those TikToks in the intro, and as you all must know, these videos got so big on TikTok and spread like wildfire. Every now and then, because of social media and the internet, these kinds of events occur quite often. You all remember the fidget spinner or the bottle flip, and nobody really knows where the practice began, but it spreads quickly through society, and this concept is known as contagious diffusion, as the practice is spread from one person to another like a disease. Then we have stimulus diffusion, and for this I like the use of good old Mickey D's as an example. In stimulus diffusion, you have a cultural practice that gets spread, but certain aspects of it change. McDonald's is a multinational company and can be seen in over 100 countries, and to cater to their diverse dietary needs, they will change certain menu items. McDonald's, the company, is staying the same, but certain aspects of it will change, like the patties or the drinks, thus making it stimulus diffusion. Another example of stimulus diffusion is how hip-hop has diffused around the world. Hip-hop started in New York and the United States, and it diffused to other countries, and now there's rap in Mandarin. So the concept of hip-hop has diffused, but the language has changed. Then for hierarchical diffusion, let's go ahead and take a look at this scene from The Devil Wears Prada.
However, that blue represents millions of dollars and countless jobs. And it's sort of comical how you think that you've made a choice that exempts you from the fashion industry when in fact you're wearing a sweater that was selected for you by the people in this room from a pile of stuff.
Notice how Meryl Streep's character is explaining to Anne Hathaway that fashion has been passed down through the ranks to the common people, and this demonstrates hierarchical diffusion. Hierarchical diffusion is the diffusion of cultural practices through people with high social status like actors, models, presidents, or singers. These practices can range from the words that they use or the clothes that they wear, and which is why famous people get free clothes from companies all the time. Then lastly, we have relocation diffusion, which is the spread of cultural practices through movement. When a group of people move to another location and they take their cultures with them, they are participating in relocation diffusion. This occurs quite often as large groups of people move to new countries and they take their cultures along with them. When the Chinese moved to the United States in the 1800s, they brought along their cultures with them and established small locations to call their own, and the ethnic enclaves were created, and you could see it in the cultural landscape. Speaking of cultural landscape, this is a concept that students tend to struggle with, but it's actually quite simple. When you're at a certain location, there's a sense of place that it gives based on a few factors. First of those factors is physical location, the topography, the trees, and the terrain. When you think of mountainous regions, you might associate that with Colorado or perhaps the Appalachian region. And when you see palm trees and beaches, you might associate that with the tropical region like Hawaii or the Philippines. And when cultural landscapes include the desert, you might even think the Sahara or the Middle East. There can also be an agricultural landscape where the practices and landscapes of farmland will give you a sense of place. When you see dense forests with smaller plots of land, you might associate that with Southeast Asia. And when you see extensive commercial grain agriculture with tractors, you can be in Europe or the United States. And if you see pastoral nomadism in a non-barren environment, you might think this is Siberia. Then let's speed this up a little bit, as there are many different aspects that contribute to the cultural landscape, and that can include the types of industries that are present, religious symbols and places of worship, and lastly, probably one of the most obvious ones are going to be language and architecture, as you will see the primary language of a country and its architectural style all over the landscape. Take this street in Japan. You see the language with the Japanese signs, industry with the Japanese beer company, and architecture with its thin shops packed into a single street. Even within architecture, one can divide the different styles of a country into two terms, with its traditional folk architecture, like the architecture of its ancient civilizations, as you can see with the Mayan pyramids of Mexico, and its postmodern, which is present in the central business district of Mexico City. When you see the various layers of history in the cultural landscape, this is called sequent occupants, as you will see the influence of different civilizations within a given landscape. For example, in Mexico, you might see 3 different types of architecture because of sequent occupants, with its native population, Spanish architecture, and Mexican architecture. You're all familiar with the Pakistan meme where the students are shouting their dreams and aspirations in what seems to be their version of a pep rally. But all jokes aside, gender norms can even be seen in the cultural landscape, as in Pakistan, you'll see higher number of schools for boys compared to girls, as only 18% of Pakistani women have received 10 or more years of schooling. You can also see prevailing attitudes towards ethnicities such as ethnic enclaves that most major cities in the United States have, like Chinatown, which illustrates that this particular location has a large number of Chinese people, thus their landscape reflects that. This is further demonstrated in the US because if you visit certain native reservations, you'll be able to see their cultural landscape with the type of art or languages that might be present, and in certain parts of Indonesia, you'll be able to see the various ethnic groups and their practices in the cultural landscape. In today's GuessdatGeo, per usual, I'm going to show you around and point out a few things, and you can guess in the comments where you think this is. We do have this sign over here with some English. Zoom in on that real quick. Then there seems to be some characters on this pole right here. And then if we go right a little bit on this pillar, there's some characters as well. So go ahead and put in the comment section where you think this is. If you said South Korea, my motherland, you got it right on the money. So let's go and analyze the cultural landscape here. In the distance, you do have your postmodern buildings, which represents development. And if you scroll down right here, you do have your Southeast Asian, East Asian traditional architecture with a tiled roof. And further in the distance, you have a rocky mountainous area, as the Korean peninsula is known for its hilly, uneven terrain. And lastly, the Korean language, which is out of the 3 East Asian languages, tends to have straighter lines, boxes, and circles. However, when countries develop, they can lose their sense of place, which leads to placelessness, as postmodern architecture can take over and the cultural landscape can be dominated by the lingua franca, which would be languages that countries utilize in order to communicate with one another, in this case, English. When a country develops and big corporations end up taking up most of the landscape, it can be difficult to differentiate landscapes from one another, as demonstrated by this location in Korea. Lastly, let's go ahead and dive into the various forces that can divide and unite countries, starting with centripetal cultural forces. When trying to differentiate the two terms, think of the word petal and centripetal and how the petals of a flower are all together, thus it would be forces that bring people together. We can use the Jewish language as a centripetal force that brought the Jewish diaspora together in the Middle East, obviously accompanied by their history and religion, and thus in the 1940s the Jewish state of Israel was established. These forces brought together a large group of individuals and led to the formation of a state, despite the argument that Israel is technically experiencing centrifugal forces with its conflicts with Palestine. Some other examples of how culture can be centripetal can be seen in Japan and Iceland. These two countries have more than 90% of the population speaking the same language, which would bring the country together. Then we have centrifugal forces, and think of someone who is frugal, which sounds a lot like centrifugal, and generally frugal people are seen in a negative light, thus this is dividing the population. Canada is a really good example of how language can be a centrifugal force, as the people of Quebec speak French and the rest of Canada speaks English. This can lead to arguments in their government about representation, disputes over official languages, thus dividing the nation. Religion can also be a centrifugal force, as the Irish island ended up being divided into 2 states due to their religious differences. In the north, you have a primarily Christian population, whereas the southern side is mostly Catholic. And this led to violence and conflict between the 2 regions for decades, and it was finally resolved by creating 2 separate regions. Lastly, you can have ethnicity acting as a centrifugal force, as seen by Yugoslavia, where once they were united by the ideals of communism, but the ethnic differences eventually led to devolution and the Balkanization of the area. All right, and that about does it for the first part of the culture unit. Don't forget to utilize the Quizlet vocab down below in the description to further your understanding of the unit, and I will see you in the next video.